We've been going through our geometry unit, and two things that we've talked about are area and volume. Okay, when we find the area of something, we're finding the size of the surface of a two-dimensional shape. Okay, when we find volume, we're finding how big something is. Okay, and finding the capacity of it, how many cubic units fit inside of an object. Okay. So area was two-dimensional, volume is three-dimensional, okay? The last thing we're going to talk about is surface area, okay? So we're going to kind of combine the two things, okay? We're going to find the surface area of a three-dimensional object, okay? So if we have a rectangular prism, okay? When we find volume, we're going to find the whole size of this. How many cubic units will this take up? Okay, but when we find surface area, we're going to take only the outside. So if I was to wrap this in wrapping paper, we would want to know how much wrapping paper would fit on the outside. That's kind of what we're trying to figure out. What is the surface area? The surface is the outside of the shape. Okay, so in this case, it's a rectangular prism. So we would find the area of each face. Okay, we talked about what faces are. Okay, so we want to find the area of each face and then add them together. That's kind of what surface area is. Okay, surface area is the amount of space that the outside of a three-dimensional shape takes up. Okay, so one thing that we use to find surface area is what we call geometry net. And a geometry net is a 2D representation of a three-dimensional object. So if we have a cube, three-dimensional cube that looks like this, or a rectangular prism, okay, a geometry net is when we take this shape, which is three-dimensional, and we flatten it out. Okay, we flatten it out. So instead of being three-dimensional, it'd be two-dimensional. Okay. And that way we can see each face a lot easier. Okay, so if I take this three-dimensional shape and I flatten it out, it flattens out into this, a geometry net. This is what we call a geometry net. So this shows each face that this rectangular prism or this cube has. Okay, now there's two geometry nets that you need to know about, okay? Specifically for sixth grade. Now there's all kinds of geometry nets because every three-dimensional shape has a geometry net. But let's go through the two that you need. So the first one is a rectangular prism or a cube, okay? A rectangular prism or a cube, okay? Cube is just a rectangular prism that has all the same size sides, okay, or every edge is the same, okay? So a rectangular prism, three-dimensional rectangular prism looks like this. Okay, that's three-dimensional, okay? And the geometry net that goes with that looks like this. Okay. Now, I just draw them exactly the same every time when I'm using rectangular prisms. You don't have to worry about what size the faces are. We just use this as a guide to help us get through surface area. Okay? So, surface area is when you find out the size of the surface of a three-dimensional object. How much space does this cover up on the outside? Okay? How much space does that take up? And then one way that we do that is we use something called geometry nets. Okay? So, for a rectangular prism, the geometry net looks like this. Now let's talk about what a triangular prism looks like. So I'm going to write triangular prism. Okay. Triangular prism can be drawn like this. Okay, this is a three-dimensional triangular prism. And then the triangular prism geometry net looks like this. Okay? And what you'll notice about these is when you talked about what faces were, you were asked how many faces does a rectangular prism have? Well, it has 6. That's why there's 6 faces here when we draw the geometry net. Same thing here, when we have a triangular prism, how many faces does this triangular prism have? It has 5. That's why there's 5 faces shown on the geometry net. Okay, so these will be helpful when you're trying to find surface area of three-dimensional shapes and specifically a rectangular prism or a cube and a triangular prism.